our district really cares about everyday issues. And I think that's where we missed the mark in 2024. So much in 2024 was about where people rested ideologically. Whereas our district really cares about affordability, cares about education. Do I have high quality of life?
Welcome to Around the District. I am Nicole Brown.
And I'm Gabby Mazar.
And today we have Dr. Raquel Rockee Armstrong here. She is running for state representative in LD13. So welcome, Rockee.
Thank you.
I'm going to call you Rockee today, even though normally I'm going Raquel. Okay, tell us about you, Raquel Rockee Armstrong.
Yes. So I'm a lifelong educator. I am actually an assistant professor in educational leadership at Arizona State University. Prior to that, I served as a school administrator for 8 years and was a teacher before that. And I've been active, particularly around getting people to vote in a nonpartisan manner over the last several cycles, and really encouraging people to use their voice. And I was led to run particularly because recognizing that education is at the forefront of one of our issues at the state level here in Arizona, and having the expertise that I have and really understanding where we could go legislatively, particularly in education, but also how that impacts workforce development, how that impacts our economic growth, and really understanding that on a deep level and needing that to be represented in our state legislature led me to step away from the voter advocacy, work to running for office.
I was going to ask that, what made you want to jump in? Because LD13 traditionally is a pretty red area, right? So it's going to be, it seems like could be an uphill battle for you.
Sure.
To, actually win that seat. Because when was the last time, do you know offhand?
I do.
A Democrat actually won that seat.
Yes. So actually, surprisingly, 13 has always been a very sort of middle of the road district. It's a district that really, values business and low taxes. And we did have a Democrat serving in that role for 3 terms prior to the last cycle. So Jennifer Pollock didn't run for re-election in 2024, and we ended up losing our Democratic seat to another Republican. And now the district is served by 2 Republicans currently. However, this cycle is the first time in 16 years that we don't have sitting incumbents. Our current senator for LD13 has termed out and is running for another position. And then one of the current House state reps is running for the Senate role, and then the other one's running for mayor of Chandler. So the field is just wide open. And one thing that we've learned is that our district really cares about everyday issues. And I think that's where we missed the mark in 2024. I think so much in 2024 was about where people rested ideologically. Whereas our district really cares about affordability, cares about education, cares about, the ecosystem around the infrastructure and the industry versus do I have high quality of life. That's what they care about in 13.
Yeah, that was, you just had a really good point where we talked a lot about getting away from the so-called social issues, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially during the 2024 election.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, we average voters in Arizona, we just want to know, can we afford to still live
That's
here?
right.
Because the cost of living since I moved here 14 years ago has gone up.
That's right.
Tremendously, right? And so it's really good that you say that. So talk about, if you are elected,
mm-hmm.
What do you think is before right now, what's the problem with the legislators, and how can you change what's happening as far as affordability is concerned?
For sure. So, there's a couple things that I think about. Obviously my expertise rests in education, but there is a correlation between education and being able to come out and be able to have a job that you can actually afford to live, right? And so if, we know that statistically people want to live within 20 minutes of where they work, right? So if we take an inventory of all the available jobs and businesses in our district or close to our district, what's the average salary that's being offered? Are we ensuring that our kids that are coming through our school systems are prepared for those jobs, have access to those jobs, and thus can then afford to live. Even thinking about, the actual being able to purchase a home versus just being a renter. Those are things that the city is trying to attack, but there are policies at the legislature that prohibit cities from actually implementing their plans. Cities can't, put rental caps. Cities can't,
Yep.
address some of these other issues around companies that are coming in and buying up all the available housing so that when new jobs come, right, people can't find a home to purchase, right? So all those are things that I think the state legislature can address from, the programmatic side of schooling and making sure there's proper funding for our schools, but then also, addressing what companies can and cannot do so that we have the available housing that we need.
Do
Can
you
you
think?
talk a little bit specifically about your district? Like, where is your district? Because it is part of it is Sun Lakes too, which is
Sure.
retirement. So you have part of Gilbert, part of
Mhm.
Chandler, which is younger families, and an older retirement community
Mhm.
as well. So how do you plan? What is your plan for kind of merging those two
Sure.
for affordability? In general.
So, ironically, while those populations may seem very different, the needs that they're talking about are not very much different from each other at all. When I talk to residents of Sun Lakes, they're worried for their grandchildren. They're worried what their grandchildren are going to have access to, or nieces and nephews. But also because many of them are on fixed incomes
Mm-hmm.
right now, they're very concerned about affordability because they may have their retirement and then a little bit of a nest egg that is, they're losing between, rising costs of utilities and all those things. And so that is also impacting our families and childcare. That's also impacting even single professionals like myself, and where affordability, it's becoming less affordable to live in our district.
Yeah.
And so I think particularly thinking about our Sun Lakes population, they're very concerned about healthcare. And while we think about that as a federal issue, there are things where the state has to be a stopgap in order to ensure that they're able to stay and live and thrive, because many are truly very afraid right now.
Isn't Chandler? That's where they wanted to build that data center, and the
Hmm.
Chandler City Council recently voted that down and
Yes.
rejected it,
Yeah.
Yes.
and mainly because it doesn't provide. There's no benefit to Chandler, really, the residents of Chandler,
Hmm.
to have a data center because it's going to one take up the cost of water, one which we know there's a shortage here in
Hmm.
Arizona, and then there's no real employment, right? Because the data center.
Right. So they made the argument, the company made the argument that roughly 30 to 50 jobs that were by law offering over $70,000, and many of these things, came from city statutes, right? Jobs that were being created had to make over 70,000. They had to use a closed loop water system to reduce the impact on water for constituents. But at the end of the day, 30 to 50 jobs for the amount of money that's invested in a project like that does not provide an overall benefit that outweighs the opportunity costs for our community, right? Because there still needs to be studies on, what is the environmental waste that happens. Even if you have a closed loop water system and you're not consistently, plugging with water, the power, are you powering up your own facility, right? Where is this coming from? What drain is this? How's it going to raise the rates for people? And then we know that, folks in Tempe are experiencing this. Folks in Phoenix are experiencing the noise pollution and how that actually impacts what's going on. What is the long-standing like outcome of that in communities? We don't know yet, right? We don't have the data to say how bad is this for our community. And so I think the Chandler City Council made the right call in this moment. But I wouldn't be surprised, at the end of the day, we are using AI at alarming rates. It's coming.
Mhm.
And for that to work, you got to have data centers. So, I had the opportunity to meet with a data center architect, and we talked about like what are the different things they're doing to create a more efficient ways of the centers for working. And they're still trying to figure that out because I don't think they're going anywhere. We
Mhm.
just have to figure out how to mitigate the amount of
The
damage
impact.
that it can do,
Yeah.
in our
To the
community.
residents, and
Mhm.
increasing rates, because affordability is a big issue, even though the
Mhm.
current president of the United States says it's a hoax, right? But it is an issue. So do you think the leg is listening to the constituents in Arizona, about the affordability issue?
I think so. I do. I think they are, but I think there's different approaches to getting there. I think when I think about our GOP, their focus is, well, if we keep taxes low, that's addressing the affordability. But 60% of the state budget goes to tax cuts and subsidies. Unfortunately, as a state, we can't afford any more tax cuts that aren't going to now show up in additional expenses for constituents. So we're going to have to rethink what our money is going to. So if we have, growing companies or whatever, if we're renewing some of these cuts, right? What are the benefits that you're giving to our community, right? How many more jobs are actually being created, right? We see some of these entities that brought in that are getting major cuts from our state also have been reducing their workforce, right? So
So
where's
where's
the
the
real
benefit? Exactly.
And whose jobs are being replaced?
Right, these jobs are being replaced,
Exactly, because
Right.
there's that issue of
Right.
folks
Yes.
being laid
Yes.
off because they don't need the physical body
Exactly.
there anymore.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
there's that. Okay, well, let's turn to education because you're an educator, I'm an educator, and we know that's been a big issue here in Arizona. And it's always been. So from your perspective, what's working and what's clearly not with education?
That's a tough question because I think what's not working is very much at the forefront of the news. I mean, we've all seen the headlines around just how much our empowerment scholarship account program is draining from our system. And I think we're now seeing that fallout. I mean, yes, people are saying we have declining enrollment, but there's more underneath, right? When you're siphoning $1 billion from public schools, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy when schools don't do well. You need money to function.
Right.
Right. And as I explain it to people, I'm not anti-school choice. I think it's important to have options. Traditional public schools do not work for everyone. But when this program was created, it was originally about students who might have significant special needs that needed some different options, right? We need those things. But now we have a situation where people are using them like 529 accounts. They're investment accounts, right? It's not about, the actual education of children today. And more so, if you choose to, let's say you have an ESA account, you choose to homeschool your kid, and then you want to put them in public schools, or they're getting resources from public schools. Guess what? That school district still has to put up that money. They still have to hire that additional teacher. They have to, pay the light bill, like whatever the case may be. And so those costs are exponential to the amount of money that is floating back and forth with our ESA program. And so ultimately, we're seeing even the best of the best really struggling to stay above water. And so they have to go every cycle before residents for new bonds, new override. You know what I mean? Like, and it's hard, it becomes harder to articulate to constituents, why do I have to keep coming for more money? Right? It's hard to really articulate why, what it's even doing. And people are like, well, where's the money going? Well, if we do an inventory of what's happening at the state level, right? How much waste is happening there? It's interesting that the current administration, really marketed this idea that we're trying to get rid of waste when it's just shuffling the waste around to benefit a few,
Right.
right? As opposed to really looking at where is this money going and who is it benefiting. And so I think, the funding is definitely a big part of it. But it's also some of the limits, that aggregate expenditure limit, that has to go, right? It doesn't correlate with the way costs, inflation, right? And so the money that districts are supposed to have, they're not even able to spend. So you have that, but then also it's rethinking programmatically. There's, currently there's a number of school districts that have a case with EVIT around workforce development programs and how they're able to execute those programs. We have districts, I mean, I'm even thinking about, Chandler Unified, right in my district. They have a robust program that is all about setting up kids so that they can go into these apprenticeship programs, they can come out certified. Every kid isn't going to college.
Right.
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 And so they're trying to make sure that we truly have 21st century ready kids. But there's all these limitations based on who we're partnered with and how the legislation allows them to function. Legislation shouldn't be a barrier, right? You should allow the experts to be able to do the expert work.
And is the legislators, the legislation, are they the ones that are blocking the investigation into the ESA concerns, or is that the superintendent of instruction
That is
currently doing?
currently the superintendent of public instruction and sort of creating some barriers around what is being released to the public. I think where the legislature comes in is the legislature decides how much money gets allocated, right? It's more of a funding piece, but the superintendent of public instruction gets to decide how that work is done. And I think that's where the sort of difference is, right? But I think where the legislature can step in is guardrails, right? We can put in guardrails. I'm not saying that the entire ESA program needs to go. I know there are plenty of people who believe that, but I do think that there's some benefit for those who are using it right.
If
You
it were
know,
the intent of
if the
if the
intent
intent was right.
was
Because
right.
what, like you
Mhm.
said earlier, what it was intended for and the
Mhm.
actual usage of the
Correct.
ESA is completely different.
But I bet if you had guardrails where folks had to spend that money the same way that public schools do and account for every penny, less people would be using it.
Yeah. Ex-
Right? If
because
it had to be spent that same year,
yeah,
just like public schools, right? You got to spend this money. You can't
let
how
it
it works.
carry
You
over.
can't. There's no carryover like that. I mean, there's lots of rules and things around that. If those same rules existed, right? I think it'd be very different. And that's just with some guardrails,
Right.
right? So
Because we did a podcast and we talked about this a little bit before, and it would the thing about that was we were heard people were using it for like personal stuff,
oh
like
yeah,
home improvements and repairs,
oh yeah,
and I mean I get that benefits a student,
but that's a
globally.
stretch.
I know it's a stretch because it's the whole family, and so there's no parameters
Mm-hmm.
there to really kind of keep that in focus on what the intent should be used for.
And we also have situations where, I've even heard from people I know who are like, I got this because my child is special needs, but I told them I'm no longer using it and it's money just sitting. Accounts that just have money that unaccounted for. Just sitting.
And it impacts, okay, so where the need is educationally, like we have a teacher shortage in Arizona, schools are
Absolutely.
closing because enrollment is down. So that money could be allocated in so many different areas that are beneficial to the system as a whole,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
Versus the way it's currently being used. And so if you were to be elected to represent District 13, how would you try to bring to focus some of those issues?
Sure. Like I said, I think the first thing to me is starting with the guardrails around ESAs. I think if we're able to, cut down some of that spending by making sure that, the accounts need to be spent those same years, um, not having automatic approvals. I think that everything should be evaluated in the same way that public schools are. But then in addition to that, we also need to, there was a report that was done on the teacher shortage and what's really impacting. And the piece that's missing, and it's actually tied to my research as a scholar, is around the well-being of educators. One of the number one reasons why folks are leaving the field isn't just about how much they're paid. It's about the fact that they actually don't, many people don't feel safe. And it's not from like a physical, behavior of students. It's about the psychological toll of working in education, being underappreciated, not having the resources that you need, and really addressing what that looks like in our public school systems in a robust way. I think there are different places across the country that have tried to really take that up. That could be lessons for Arizona on things that we can try in order to address that shortage. I mean, if it were you, would you want to go, spend, let's say, the workday might be 8 hours, but you're spending 14, 15 hours a day working in education for maybe $50,000 a year, for people to say that your job doesn't mean anything, you're not valuable, you're a dime a dozen, you're
Except because I've been an educator, you're also a babysitter,
and
the parents want to know why you're not
Yep.
like
Yep.
their kids on all areas of life.
On-
the parents should be involved, in my
Right.
opinion.
Oh,
All of that.
all the things, right? You're
All
the
things.
reason for America's downfall. Well, that's the best part. As a side note, the best part about COVID was I think people really realized how important teachers were. It was the first time they were like, "Oh wait, this isn't an easy job."
They couldn't wait to get their kids out of the house and back to the classrooms, right?
So we're going to come back to this subject on the next episode, but for now, we're gonna cut this episode to an end. But well, keep keep an eye out for the next episode here. So share your comments for around the districts. Like, share, let us know what you think, and if you have any comments for this episode, let us know.